Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Today, I am interviewing Shannon Lee Mannion, who is the secretary of the Indian Residential Schools Research Group, which is a group of, I think it has about 10 members who are active researchers on the residential schools. But as well, Shannon and I have known each other for a long time, going back even before the Kamloops claim was being made. And she has been working on another kind of email ring that has some members of the research group on it, but then some people like myself, who I'm not a member of the Indian Residential Schools Research Group, really. I'm very interested in what they do, but it's just too many different things to be involved in. So we have this email discussions from time to time about various claims that are being made and facts that are disputed, these sorts of things. And that's been going on now for about 4 years, the discussions since the Kamloops case. And it was actually the researcher Nina Green, the incredible researcher Nina Green, who brought us all together in this research group. And we are finally making some headway on this file, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. So before we get into the topic that we want to talk about today, which is the issue of the rib bone, the famous rib bone that the GPR operator Sarah Bollier, and that's how she pronounces her name. I know it should be Beaulieu, but she pronounces it Bollier. That she referred to. I think there was a press release that referred to this, and then she discussed it in her July 15th presentation. Before we start talking about that specifically, perhaps you could just tell the audience how you became interested in Aboriginal issues or the residential schools. Like, how did you come to be where you are today?
Well, it's interesting, Francis. I actually went to university in Sault Ste. Marie, and the university was held at Shinwalk Hall, which was an Indian residential school up until, well, I think it opened in the 30s, 32. I think the cornerstone said 32. But in 1970, the Anglicans said that the building, which was no longer being used as a dormitory, could be used for something else. And so some people started a university at that building, which became or is known today as Algoma University. So I used to be quite aware going up those front stairs that, hundreds of Indian children's feet had gone up those cement stairs and through that arched door. Um, and then when I finished school in Sault Ste. Marie and returned to Ottawa, I became more interested because things were heating up at that point. You know, um, the Aboriginals, Indigenous were pushing themselves forward, and some of what was going on because living in the Sioux for I think I was there 5 years, there are 3 or 4 Indian reservations around Sault Ste. Marie, and so the Indigenous there's an omnipresence there that informs many things in the town, and some of their concerns, some of their ongoing complaints, let's say, were now being given a wider stage across Canada. And so eventually I moved from Ottawa to a small town, and that's when things really started to become very interesting because, again, there was more pushback from the Indigenous. And some of us were thinking, well, wait a minute, that never happened, or that doesn't seem right. And I was just fortunate enough to connect with people like you, Francis, and other people in our group. And here we are today.
So, to get to the heart of the matter, we have this issue of the rib bone that was claimed to have surfaced in the apple orchard. And it was claimed, in fact, that the reason why they went and did the GPR survey in the apple orchard, besides the juvenile tooth and the claims of the knowledge keepers, And the juvenile tooth has since been said by Hugo Cardozo, who is the chair of the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department, to be not human. So that was discounted. We still, however, have the claim of the human rib bone that surfaced, they
Yeah.
said. Could you just tell us a little bit about that and then what led you to go and make the police report about it?
Well, it seemed kind of kind of fortuitous for the Aboriginals that a tourist, I think, tripped over the bone in the ground. And um, I'm not I'm not sure, but I mean ribs are all attached to our backbone, and so whether you're a horizontal animal or you're an upright animal like us, the ribs are all going to come around in a cage, which is why they're called a rib cage, and going to be very similar in mammals. Now, I don't believe they've done any DNA testing of that bone. They're just assuming that it is the rib bone of a child. And hence it could, a coyote or a wolf would have small ribs like that. Our adult ribs would be bigger, but this is a smaller rib. Now, I've never seen it, but I think it was just fortuitous that, they said, "Oh, look at what we have here. It's a child's rib bone. Oh no."
And so that was the claim. And I believe they did claim in the 2000s the rib bone was found by a tourist and turned into the museum. That was the
Yeah.
claim. Many people have tried to ask various people in the band. The most probable was Dina Jules, who was the head of the museum for quite some
Hmm.
time. I believe Marianne Ignace, if that's how she pronounces the name,
Hmm.
she is Ron Ignace's wife. She as well was, and maybe I'm misspeaking here, but I know that Manny Jules has some connection through some person to the museum as well. And maybe it's not Marianne Ignace because I think it's a relationship to Manny Jules. And then we had one of our journalist colleagues, Will Dove. We were in Kamloops for a week last week with lots of interesting things that happened. Anyway, Will Dove went into the museum, bought a ticket, went into the museum, and asked a gentleman there about the rib bone. And the gentleman said he didn't know anything about it. They've been instructed not to talk about it, the
Oh.
staff, anything to do with the graves. And that the person who would most be able to answer questions about the rib bone was Jeanette Jules. And Jeanette Jules is a very prominent member of the
Mhm.
Kamloops Indian Band, the sister of Dina Jules, Frida Jules, and Manny Jules. She is a recognized knowledge keeper, just like Dina Jules is.
Hmm.
He was there at the Sarah Beaulier um, spiritual supports being provided kind of episode with Sarah Beaulier's
Oh,
GPR work.
yeah.
She gave a presentation in May 2022 at the first year anniversary memorial saying children buried on these grounds. She stated that and said that children have been put in incinerators as well during this presentation. So she is a knowledge keeper, so she supposedly has some understanding of what's happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The other interesting thing about Jeanette Jules is that in 2013, we have a recording of Jeanette Jules at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing in Kamloops, where she didn't mention anything about children being buried on the grounds, didn't mention anything about the incinerators, and did mention one case of a boy who was kicked down the stairs. So that was the claim that she made
Hmm.
in this case. She also, in the 2022 presentation, said children had been deloused with DDT and were suffering from cancer now because of the delousing process, plus a number of other claims. So that's going to be interesting to try to follow up with Jeanette Jules about
Mhm.
what she knows. But I really do think Dina Jules was the person in charge of the museum when, because she was speaking on the Fifth Estate program
Right.
in January 2022, and they had identified her as the key museum person, and Jeanette Jules wasn't part of the discussion at all at that time. So I think both of those figures seem to have been identified as people to talk to. And have
Seem-
you had any conversations with or tried to get in touch at all with any member of the band?
My God, they all seem to have the last name Jules. You know,
A lot of
just
them
call a
do.
number, you get them all. Um, no, I haven't actually spoken to anybody at the actual band. I haven't spoken to any Indigenous people that I can recall. I don't think so. But it's it's pretty fortuitous that somebody just happened to be strolling along and they kicked up a rib bone in the dirt. I mean, what are the chances of one rib bone being there? I mean, if there was a body, you would have a lot of rib bones. You'd have a lot of bones, but one rib bone. And again, no real analysis. And when we've got when you see there's it seems the whole Jules family is involved. Well, that's like putting brick upon brick, and they're all going to support one another, and no one's going to say, well, no, that's a bone of a wolf or a dog. That's a dog's bone. No, no, nobody's going to come up with that. So they're all singing from the same choir sheets. So I don't know how we would get get around that because we don't have access to that bone, so we can't do any DNA analysis. So I'm not really sure. It all seems very incestuous what's going on. I think so.
Well, tribal, definitely tribal kinship relations. That's the way
Sure.
bands are organized. And there's a few powerful families,
Hmm.
13 family heads, as we've heard about. Manny Jules is one of the heads of the 13
Yes.
family heads. And I believe there's another woman by the name of Connie Jules, who's also a member, one
Wow.
of the 13 family heads. So the Jules seem to have two separate lines that are
Hmm.
represented in the 13 family heads. And I should mention that Manny Jules and Ted Gottfriedson Jr., and Gottfriedson is another name that's very
Hmm.
prominent at Thompson Rivers University, especially.
Hmm.
Both Manny Jules and Ted Gottfriedson Jr. said that excavations would be done in the Fifth Estate program in January 2022. The
Hmm.
family heads, the 13 family heads, had gotten together and had decided to do this. So we're still waiting on that one
Well, there's
because
money available. Isn't there money that was provided?
$12.1 million was provided.
That's a lot of
So,
excavation.
yes. And so that is not, and that was evidently earmarked in 2021 to 2023
Hmm.
in from the what we pieced together from the Blacklocks documents. So we're
Right.
still waiting on that. We're making that demand because there's no other way to determine if there are burials on that site except through excavations.
Well, I
That's
mean,
the only way to do it.
I was wondering, is there a way of I thought I read something about soil testing using a probe and checking for DNA. Is that also an option?
I've talked to a few people about this, and there's a bit of uncertainty about it due to contamination of the site. For example, it's a
Mm-hmm.
septic field, that area, so there's going to be
Yeah.
DNA from the septic system. I've
Mm-hmm.
been told that you can distinguish DNA on this basis. The technology is not as certain, but I've heard you can do that. So that would be another possibility is let's go and try that and see if there's
Mm-hmm.
anything that comes up. But since the money was made available for excavations, and because you don't need to take any bones out, like all you need to do is kind of take off the soil, see if
Yeah.
you get a septic tile or not, or like you
Yeah.
don't have to do any movement of remains at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
All we want to know now is just is this number 200, which is now the claim, not 215, it's 200 targets of interest. let's go to where there's the most concentrated number of them, which seems to be around the septic field, and see if there's any bones that emerge from there. And if not, then that raises new questions, like
Mm.
would the bones have just completely been absorbed into that kind of soil? It's not wet soil, so they probably would have been maintained at a have more integrity than in, for example,
Mhm.
Cooper Island case. That was the case with Cooper Island. But anyway, this is all pending and unfolding as we
Yeah.
speak. But let's go back to so we had all this happen in
Yeah.
2021. There's this open question about the rib bone. It was never answered. Sarah Bollier was sent many, many emails from by many, many different people, never answered any of them. And then in 2022, you decided to go to the RCMP about this. Why
Mm.
did you do that, and what happened with respect to this situation?
I spoke to Sergeant Wallace at the RCMP detachment on the actual Kamloops Reserve. I think it's right there, right on the reserve.
Yes.
And I asked him about the bone, and he didn't have any information. I'm not sure who had possession of the bone at that time. That would have been interesting to follow the trail of evidence. What happened? The first person had the bone, then where did it go? Who who was it passed on to? I don't know whether I've ever really heard very much about that.
Hmm.
Do we know where the bone is right now? Is it at the museum or where is it? Who has it?
And who turned it in? There was a tourist, evidently, who turned in the bone. That's the story. So, who was the tourist who turned in the bone? Did they give their name?
Hmm.
What was the kind of circumstances that surrounded this? Who did the tourist give the bone to?
Yeah.
Why did the museum decide not to turn that bone into the RCMP at the time?
Well, that's a good question. Once we know the chain that the evidence went through, then we could answer that question. But it's so difficult now, 4 years later, to to be asking these questions because a lot of water's gone under the bridge, and bone or not, the indigenous have in my opinion, have got the bit in their teeth. They've got all sorts of things working for them. They're a great big force to be dealt with, and bone or not, we're kind of up against it 3 years later, 4 years later.
Well, the concern that I have, and this was my reaction to the news in July 2021, that the additional, because we initially had the announcement, I'm just trying to put my head back into that time, and I had been following the residential schools file for quite some time, so I was aware of the somewhat improbable claims that would come up in the context of the
Hmm.
residential schools. So
Hmm.
I was a bit skeptical about this. And then talking to the research group members, we actually had an event on July 10th, I think this is July 10th, 2021, called Can We Discuss Those in Unmarked Graves, with
Mm.
Brian Giesbrecht, Rodney Clifton, and Paul Viminetz, who was the moderator. And I remember both Rodney Clifton and Brian Giesbrecht talking about the cemeteries that have been abandoned and many of the markers have deteriorated. So
Mm.
Brian Giesbrecht especially was making the point, we need to find out whether this is an abandoned cemetery or not. It might be the case, but then we found out quite soon after that that there was a cemetery on the actual reserve across from St.
Right.
Joseph's Catholic Church. So that meant that that area in the apple orchard could not have been an abandoned cemetery. It would have been a clandestine burial if there were remains there, which is a completely different scenario than most of the things that we're talking about, such as Cowessus, the Cowessus case, where
Yeah,
there
yeah.
are 751 supposed hits on the
Hmm.
GPR.
Hmm. Hmm.
That was a community cemetery. Everyone knew that was not even an Aboriginal cemetery,
Right.
yet we still had Cadmus Delorme, the chief, beating the drum, saying this was a crime scene, acting
Hmm.
in a very unethical manner. and he should be taken to task for that because people like Terry Glavin continue to pretend
Hmm.
that the Aboriginal neo-tribal elites have not been involved in this deception at all, and this is not true. There's been
That's
a
right.
lot of deception that's been going. Now, whether it's self-deception and they actually believe it or not, that's something that still needs to be investigated. So
You're
that
right.
was kind of the nature of the story. But when I heard this and I heard about the rib bone and the tooth,
Mm-hmm.
both of those pieces of evidence made me believe it more than I would have believed it without those pieces of
Oh, of
evidence.
course.
Because
Yeah.
that was the material smoking gun.
Hmm.
Knowledge keepers we know are not very reliable. GPR we know doesn't give us any indication of whether it's actual remains. It's what a GPR expert told me is a thing finder. You find the things,
Yeah.
but you don't
Yeah.
know what those things are.
No.
But the rib bone and the tooth were, hey, there's some evidence here that is really warrants further investigation. And imagine our annoyance of constantly trying to get answers about, well, we got the answers about the tooth,
Hmm.
which in my view is a serious something that Sarah Bollier should answer for because she should have known that before she even started this GPR work. You
Yes.
do a background investigation before you even start to find out
Yeah,
about all the
definitely.
excavations and
Hmm.
everything, and that should have been part of her knowledge base, just talking to people. But she obviously just arrived and got these spiritual supports with tobacco ties hanging from the trees and all the people helping her with
Right.
the horror that she
Yeah.
was having to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of priming going on, and then because she didn't do her background research, then we got the tooth and the rib bone is still an unanswered question because
Yeah,
the
exactly.
archaeology department has not said anything, yet none of the band will answer any questions about this.
Of course
And
not.
that to me is a serious
Breach.
obfuscation on their part,
It
and
is.
they should be held to account for this. They shouldn't
Absolutely.
just be able to get away with making these claims, and now everyone says, "Oh well, like who cares where the rib bone is? It doesn't matter anyway." Nonsense. That's why a lot of people were taken in, is because
Hmm.
they were given this false information, what appears to be false. We don't know if it's false because the band could have received this bone that they had done some kind of DNA analysis on, and they just decided for some strange reason to put that on the shelf in their museum. Like that's a very, very questionable kind of thing. Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that was kind of the background for that. So for some reason you waited a year until 2022 to make this kind of report to the RCMP. Could you tell us about why you waited that long and what you did with what happened with respect to the RCMP?
I I think things I, I'm not sure why I waited that long or what compelled me to call the RCMP. Maybe, sometimes you have to have a critical mass of information, and it has to look like there's something going on, and we're thinking, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step? And as a former journalist, it's all about, looking into, well, who said this and why did they say it and when and how and all these things. So I guess what we were all sort of, as our group, talking about things, and how do we move forward on all of this? How do we disprove what people are believing, without any real vetted evidence? Well, my training would say, well, we go to the mouth of the horse, and in this case, it's the RCMP, because they're the ones who accepted this as a bona fide rib cage bone of a human being. And why? Like, what was going on there, and what happened from there? Well, that's not something that I know about. Even calling up the RCMP, they're fairly vague. They're vague about it. I mean, I guess we're all vague about it because what was it? One bone, and we're trying to build a case on it. Well, we don't need the bone because we know now what's going on. We know that there's been a lot of obfuscation, and people are chasing the almighty dollar bill. There's a lot of money involved in the what do they call the indigenous industry, Indian industry, and everybody wants to be at the trough. I mean, I know that sounds pretty blunt, but that's pretty much what it is to me.
Well, because, it just is a fact that because of this discovery that they claim they made in May 2021, they made an application
Hmm.
to the Crown Indigenous Relations Department
Hmm.
for, I believe the application was for about $9 million. And so
Dear
that's
me.
on the actual documents. Ancestral excavations. We have conversations happening with Jeanette Jules. She's one of the figures of this.
Hmm.
There's a couple of others, but they seem to be minor players. Anyway, they're all on this call with the government talking about how to shape their application to get these millions of dollars. And it turned out being $12.1 million. So there was actual money that was allocated because
Yeah.
of this claim. And then there was many other millions of dollars and many other initiatives that flowed from them making claims. So money is involved, and
Big money.
that can shape your perception of things.
Well, especially big money like that.
People tend to follow their interests, and
Hmm.
if they sense, and it doesn't even have to be deliberate, it can just be confirmation bias that you want to hear things that are going to suit your interests and you don't want to really hear things that don't. So we don't need to go into really nefarious motives. Now, of course, there was a lot of lawyers and consultants and
Yeah.
publicists
Hmm.
working behind the scenes who know very well
Hmm.
what kinds of implications that this is going to have. So
Yeah.
I don't give them as much slack. And then of course there is this idea of the different conceptions of truth. So the truth of Roseanne Casimir is
Yeah.
different than my truth, and the truth of Ted Gottfriedson is different
Uh,
from my
Whoa,
truth.
that drives me crazy. To me, there's only one truth. There's only one thing that happened. There's only one accuracy. Truth can't be variable like that. I don't think. I really don't.
Me neither. Me neither. But the Aboriginal um, worldview, which does not sit easily with the scientific type of process, has this kind of relativistic thing built in, which is directly tied to oral histories. And oral histories are not like written history. Well, first of all, we used to say that there's no such thing as oral history because history is written down, and before history it was just societies without writing that used to have kind of performative stories that they would do, and that story would be changed according to whatever purpose that
Yeah,
that story was going to be used to suit. But so we've got this kind of this gap that exists, this gulf.
right.
Are we going to follow the scientific kind of process, or are we going to follow the knowledge keepers kind of way of doing things? And we haven't really made a definitive statement on this, and we've
Mm.
pretended that somehow they're compatible when they're not.
No, they're not.
They're opposed to one another, but
Hmm.
because that's insensitive to state these claims, we are where we are today. So everyone's, Sarah Bollier is a very good example of this. She
Yeah,
says that you've got to use both. You've got to use the knowledge keepers approach, and you've got to use the scientific method, and you've got to make those two things fit with one another when they're contradictory, and you've got to choose a side. And I think that most um, Canadians would say, well, we've got to have the scientific process here. And in fact, it's being demanded of us that we accept
yeah.
this as true. And
Hmm.
so you can't have it both ways. If you're going to demand universality of acceptance, we've got to use the method that is going to enable us to develop a universal kind of position.
That's
Um,
right.
but sorry, I'm grandstanding here a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask about accountability through all of this. People get given a lot of money, $12 million, and where's the accountability? Where does the buck stop? Or who? We need accountability. You've got to pay for pay to play, pay for what you've got. Somebody gave you $12 million to do a job. Okay, get on it. I mean, this is what I would say. I mean, this is the way we were brought up. This is the way the world rolls. Not
Exactly.
not
It's
through
just not.
procrastination. And then where did that money go? Did everybody get a cool mill? You 12 people line up, here's your mill, here's your mill. Where did the money go to?
Well, according to Blacklock's reporter, which has done some analysis of this, it's hard because I've looked through those documents and they're redacted and they're all over the place. So you have to kind of really commit some serious brain power to doing this.
Yeah.
And according to Blacklock's, it appears that it went to consultants, 25 consultants, and some of it went for security. I think about $600,000 went to security. A couple of grief counselors got $100,000 or so, but most of it is it's still unknown specifically because of the red actions that
Yeah.
existed. But
Well,
in terms of,
how many
go
of
ahead.
these consultants were Aboriginal? Were they all Aboriginal? Were they all
You
members of
won't,
the tribe?
you don't know,
I bet
and there's
nobody
the
asked
name.
that question.
Well, we don't have because of the documents.
Yeah.
We don't know the names of the consultants. We just have it mentioned somewhere that there were 25 of them and
Wow.
publicists who got paid from this $12.1 million. And
Yeah.
I noticed that the band was lobbying hard for legal fees to be paid. And it was originally in the email correspondence that we had the government saying to them,
Hmm.
legal fees are not covered in this
Oh.
application. So you can't use the application to cover.
Right.
But whether that got allocated in that way,
Hmm.
we have determining it because everything's redacted and we don't know exactly what happened. But getting back to the rib bone and the RCMP, in when you went to the RCMP in 2022, and you there is some footage of this from Drea Humphrey's
Yes.
documentary, The Buried Truth, and this is why I really wanted to interview Shannon, is because I wanted to get an update on this and also get Shannon's face and name to those claims because
Hmm.
in the Drea Humphrey documentary, Shannon was anonymous because of the high sensitivity that existed at that time. But now we're now 4.5 years down the road, and
Hmm.
people are getting a bit tired of this obfuscation.
Yes.
And the band, we shouldn't have racism of low expectations here. The
Yeah.
band should be held to account just like everyone else in Canada is held to account. And this is what we're trying to do here. In
Hmm.
that interview with Drea Humphrey, you mentioned that the reason why you went to the police in 2022 was because of the first anniversary. So the first anniversary
Yes.
came about.
Hmm.
We had all these absurd presentations going on at the memorial,
Yeah.
which seemed to completely disregard that Sarah Bollier had said that there was 200 targets of interest and this could only be determined if there remains there through
Right.
excavations. That was
Yes.
the thing in July 15th, 2021.
Hmm.
Then we have the 1 year anniversary where everyone seems to completely forgotten that and they're talking about children
Hmm.
buried on the grounds.
Yeah.
They had a name that they developed according to Ted Godfreyson Jr. that we're not going to call the children buried the 215 anymore because Aboriginal people were called numbers in residential schools. Therefore, we're very sensitive to numbers being deployed in
Hmm.
discussing, you know, these
Hmm.
remains of children. So they now had developed a new term in the Aboriginal language called Lisqueque.
Right.
So you
Yeah.
hear this Lisqueque over and over
Hmm.
again, which means the 215 children who are alleged to be buried on in the apple orchard.
Does it mean the disappeared? Is that a direct translation? The disappeared?
The missing is what they
Missing?
say the translation.
Okay.
Now, of
Mm.
course, and this is just my opinion, I think this is all deliberate public relations and not necessarily the Aboriginal people, because I think Aboriginal people, including the neo-tribal elites,
Hmm.
are being seriously manipulated by the Aboriginal industry of very smart lawyers and
Hmm.
consultants who are
Yeah.
trying to beat these drums to extract more transfers from the government and other entities in any way that they can push it. And they use the Aboriginal suffering to get people to sympathize with this. Because if you just had people like Tony Merchant, who is the most,
Yeah.
um, you know, ardent Aboriginal industry lawyer out there,
Yeah.
made millions upon millions of dollars
Oh,
from
yeah.
all of this,
Yeah.
everyone would see him as a bit of a shark and
Hmm.
wouldn't listen to him. But if he can bring some Aboriginal neo-tribal elites out and have them, paraded in front of him,
Hmm.
then everyone's going to listen much more to that. And I think this is what's happening now in this case, or it's happened from the beginning, because everything was very, very controlled and manufactured. And you had all these publicists and lawyers and consultants and so on who were trying to control this message as much as they could. And I think this calling of the 215 Lesqueque was part of this, because if you continued to say the 215,
Hmm.
someone's going to catch on to the fact that Sarah Bollier stated in July 15th, 2021, that it wasn't 215, it was 200 targets of interest. And as well, the missing could be this other situation that does exist, which is there's children who are buried in cemeteries that have been abandoned or don't
Right.
have markers anymore. And
Mm.
so when parents refer to the missing, it's like the mother of Romeo Saganash, whose son died at Moose Factory and was buried in a cemetery in Moose Factory,
Hmm.
and the mother didn't know exactly where in that cemetery her son was buried. So the missing is also another interpretation of those words, but it has a
Mm.
sound as if it is, as you said, the disappeared
Yeah.
children who disappeared, and then no one knew what happened to them, and it's like they disappeared in the middle of the night
I,
and so
yeah, well, my experience having gone to school at a former Indian residential school, there was a small chapel on the grounds and a cemetery. Okay, most of the schools probably had a place of worship because they were church run, and there would be concomitant cemeteries there. When I was at Algoma University, which was the former Shinwalk Hall, where Indian residential schools were boarded and educated, there was a small cemetery, completely overgrown. Um, the little chapel was a delightful little stone place called Bishop Fauquier Chapel, and his wife was buried in this little cemetery. And I think her headstone, because it was probably larger than others, was still standing, but the others were all higgledy-piggledy, and they were through this sort of um, rough bit of woods that went down the side of the property of the university. And nobody took any notice of this at all. At all. And my regret is that I didn't take more photos. Back then we didn't have digital, we had film. And I have a couple of photos, but I wouldn't even know where those negs are. But that that I believe is probably a situation that was replicated across the country at residential schools, where you had these small cemeteries because children would die of disease. They it could be awkward to get them back to the reserve. Did the reserves have their own cemeteries even? If by this time a lot of the indigenous people had been converted to Christianity, and so they would be associated with a church, which would be associated with their own cemetery. So dead people would be buried in that religion at that cemetery. I don't think, I mean, when I lived in Sault Ste. Marie, there were 3 or 4 reserves. I'd been on them. I never noticed any cemeteries. They were mostly more like really um they 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 were on the outskirts of town, and small houses, usually two 2 to 3 bedrooms. They were, government made prefabs. And But this in some situations was better housing than poor people in town, where people were living in, people's basements and didn't have their own private dwellings. People had their private dwellings, row and row and rows, like a subdivision on the outskirts of town. Um, and this was good. This was good. I remember I was a taxi driver when I was 21 years old in Sault Ste. Marie, and I would drive the natives because many of them didn't have cars. I would drive them back and forth to town, and that was a gay old time. They'd pack four people into the cab, and off we'd go, and we'd do this and do that, and because there wasn't a grocery store nearby, and it was old home week. Yeah, and of course they had money to burn because money was being supplied. Nobody worked on the reserve. There were no, there's no industry, and so yeah, the money was there to be used.
So getting back to the cemeteries and the your report to the police. So you heard
Hmm.
this anniversary, this memorial that was going on, and no mention of the rib bone that happened in the memorials. At least I've watched that entire crazy present bunch of presentations, and
Yeah.
which is amazing because at that point it was had been known for almost a year that it was uncertain as to whether there were children buried in the apple orchard.
Hmm.
It was stated by bullying, and then to have this memorial pretending, all these people pretending, with Justin Trudeau and the Governor General of Canada
Hmm.
all talking as if this this was still the remains of children that were buried there. So that rib bone was still outstanding, and you went to the police, the RCMP. They have a detachment on the reserve, which is interesting in its own right.
Hmm.
That you would have it signals that that's kind of under a certain amount of influence of the Kamloops Indian band to have it there. And then you were told by Sergeant Wallace that, what did he say to you specifically, Sergeant Wallace?
I don't know whether I can trust my memory at this point. There doesn't seem to be a problem. There wasn't they opened a file. They did open a file, and I guess they were going to take it from there, but he didn't seem to be overly concerned. It's not like, this was it would have been an historic death if it was a human death at all, because the bone was, like picked clean. It's not like it was attached to anybody at the time. So it could have just been, just, I mean, has anyone suggested the bone was planted? Could this have been something somebody put there intentionally so that they could lead people on a merry goose chase? Remember, so much of what we hear happening with the indigenous is there's always a dollar sign attached, and so that's a powerful motivator.
The Aboriginal industry, certainly. And I think it's important to distinguish between, sort of ordinary Aboriginal people who are not connected to this whole Aboriginal industry system, and then all this apparatus that's in place. It is in place to extract
Mhm.
transfers. That's
Yeah.
why it's there. And it
Mm.
doesn't go to the marginalized Aboriginal members of the community. It goes largely to lawyers and to the consultant elements, like just like this $12.1 million, which we are probably never going to find out where that went to. But you have 25 publicists and consultants.
Yeah.
They're not going to come cheap. They're going to require whatever they do to do their
Hmm.
reports and their meetings and all this kind of stuff. And then you're going to have like the powerful families are all going to get their cut out of all
Mm.
of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And at the
Mm.
end of it, there's a few sinecures here and there for some
Yeah.
grief counselors or whatever, and then that's the end of it.
But is there
Uh,
no trail? Is there no trail to all this money that gets disper dis dispensed?
it's because of self government, which is the idea that Aboriginal people should look after their own affairs, and so it's now getting, I believe, now freedom of information requests that are just with for the band are not
Hmm.
doesn't work for the band, or it doesn't apply. So that's going to be another
Oh.
kind of issue. And this these redactions that we have all these redactions in these government documents that
Hmm.
don't tell us
Hmm.
where that money is going, because the idea is because it involves Aboriginal participants,
Right.
they're protected. Their identities have got to protect. If you look at the Red Actions, all the Aboriginal, well, I'm amazed we got any of them. We get Jeanette Jules and two other people that are involved,
Hmm.
but any of the others, it's all this kind of, and that's the publicists and the
Hmm.
consultants and so on. But in terms of Wallace, he tells you that, and in the Drea Humphrey, so we're doing a follow up on the Drea Humphrey
Yeah.
interview that you did where you were anonymous, but that was you on that program.
Hmm.
Because I've watched that segment many, many times of both your call that you put into the just to the person who's answering the phones, and
Yeah.
then your discussion with Drea about a person that you followed up with about the rib bone. And I assume that that person was Wallace. He's the only person from the RCMP that you talked to.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay, so the thing that you're talking to about with Drea about this person from the RCMP that you had an additional conversation with about the file number. He said, you said that he said that it was going to be left up to the band, and the RCMP was gonna stand back from it and follow the band's lead.
I think that was the upshot.
And that's the final thing that we have about it, is that
Yes.
Staff
Yes.
Sergeant Wallace said that the RCMP was stepping back from it and allowing the band to determine what should be done about the excavations and the rib bone and so on.
Well, yeah, see, one of the problems with all this missing children thing is we don't have the name of one missing child. It's really hard to go after an anonymous, like if you don't know what you're looking for, who you're looking for, you don't have a name, how can you find them? How can you ask questions? So, without, you know, and even we're talking about an historical bone, it's an old bone. Would there even be a record of someone having placed a missing child or missing person report 50, 60 years ago? Is it, how
But if
would
you
we
did DNA
determine that?
analysis on it, so this is one thing you could do, is if you got that bone, which the band should come clean on this,
Mm,
tell us, provide the bone so the
hmm.
bone can have DNA testing done on it.
Yeah.
Once you do the DNA testing on it, if it's human, it's in all probability a coyote bone. I've heard they're all over the place in Kamloops, and they look
Mm,
very similar to a human bone, a child's bone.
yeah.
And that's what the coroner said when Drea Humphrey was interviewing the coroner. And the buried truth is that the coroner said, often we have people turn in bones who think they're
Hmm.
human, and it turns out that they're not human. They're another animal.
Right.
So
Right.
before we start jumping to conclusions about children and so on, we should test that bone and look at it to see if it's a human bone. If it is human, which is possible,
Hmm.
because they found Drea Humphrey was talking about, they found bones near the airport, and it turned out that one of them was a human bone and was from a missing person.
Wow.
And the reason how you find this is you do DNA testing,
Hmm.
and you look at, you kind of ask questions about the history and see if there's any DNA analysis of different members of the band, and then you can link that DNA of the bone to, in terms of family ties and genetics, to
Yes.
members of the band. And then once you, like, for example, if it's a bone of a someone who's
Hmm.
related to the Jules family, then you go and interview a bunch of people from the Jules family to find out,
Yes.
who disappeared and so on. And there is an interesting case of a man by the name of Jesse Jules,
Hmm.
who we've never been able to track down. He was one of Kevin Annette's associates. He's the one eyewitness, in addition to Billy Coombs, who was making claims about burials in the apple orchard. But
Right.
unlike Billy Coombs, we don't have actual footage of him saying that. All we have are Kevin Annette's words in his books that he
Yeah.
says Jesse Jules told him.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is just an example
Right.
of drawing this kind of connection. And so that could be the basis of the investigation.
Sure.
But without the rib bone,
What do we
we
do?
have no place to start.
No.
So Jeanette Jules, Dina Jules, if you're listening to this interview, you must be held to account, and it is up to you now
Yeah.
to provide that bone so
Hmm.
that we can analyze that bone.
Yes.
So that's the situation where we sit there. And because of all the obfuscation and deception that's
Hmm.
gone on for the last 4.5 years,
Hmm.
I am calling you out. I think that you have deliberately led the public to believe that there is a human rib bone when it's highly improbable that there is no such rib bone. And if that's the case, I think that you should be shamed as is appropriate because of your activities in trying to deceive the public, and whichever lawyers and consultants and so on are encouraging you to do this. Um, so in terms of this story, then,
Hmm.
um, the RCMP, I just wanted to talk briefly about why the RCMP is acting the way that it is, because it's a very strange situation.
It
So
is.
in the 1990s, you're probably aware of this, and this is something that Simon Hergott and I have been investigating a great
Hmm.
deal, and Nina Green as well, a number of people. There was a task force that was done because of complaints. The original complaints were about sexual abuse, and it was Arthur Plint that was the case. And Arthur
Yeah.
Plint had been he'd been at a number of residential schools, so um, there was possibility that sexual abuse had happened at other residential schools as well. And the RCMP wanted to thoroughly investigate this. And so what they did is any allegations of criminal acts,
Hmm.
they would investigate. It didn't matter how implausible, how much it seemed like it might be misremembering of people or anything like that,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
a big problem in
Yeah.
these kinds of cases. They would be investigating, and they spent, I believe, that the task force went on over a number of years. I believe it was 6 years, and they involved a liaison who was very, very well connected in the Aboriginal
Hmm.
communities, I should say. Her name was Charlene Bello, and Charlene Bello is known because she's been popping up all over the place, and
Yep.
she gets these kinds of really very, very jobs that are sought after in
Oh
the
yeah.
Aboriginal community because they're
Hmm.
they're leadership positions, and
Yeah.
they're well funded. Anyway, she went and got an office in Vancouver, and went around encouraging everyone who was there to come forward
Right.
with their stories of whatever criminal acts they believed had happened at the residential schools. During that entire number of years that this went on, there was not there was not one claim that came forward about the Kamloops Indian Residential School and any other residential school except for Cooper Island in terms of unmarked graves. And
Mm.
Cooper Island was excavated in the 90s because of these allegations, and nothing was found.
Right.
Um, so, if it were true that there were 200 children buried in the Kamloops apple orchard,
Hmm.
why would Charlene Bello not have heard about this at that time? That's the question.
It's an oversight, really.
And the most likely explanation is because there were no stories at that time
No.
of children going missing, children being buried clandestinely, and so on. And as well, the book Behind Closed Doors, which Nina Green
Yeah.
has thoroughly examined, you had not one claim in that, all the stories that were there about children being buried in the apple orchard, even though
Right.
people did mention the apple orchard. So we had, for example, Mona Jules, who was a knowledge keeper with the Kamloops Band. She died a couple of years ago, but she's noteworthy because she gave the presentation at Sarah Bollier's
Hmm.
presentation. She was one of the knowledge keepers who was asked to speak at
Right.
the Sarah Bollier presentation in
Yeah.
July 15th. And Mona Jules didn't mention anything about burials in that presentation. And she didn't mention anything in 2000 in her testimony in Behind Closed Doors. And we know it's Mona Jules, although she's not named, because it talks about her sister, Nellie, who died of I believe it was either hepatitis or something, a liver disease, when she was 13 years old. And so that's how we've identified Mona Jules from that story. And Mona Jules mentions the apple orchard in her
Oh,
testimony,
yeah.
but it's not to do with burials.
No.
It's to do with the hunger that students supposedly felt,
Yeah, yeah.
and the fact that they would go, and some of them would go steal apples from the apple orchard as a
Hmm.
source of food. That was
Hmm.
the context. So if these stories were so well known in the Aboriginal community, and Mona Jules is a knowledge keeper, why would Mona Jules not have said something about these burials in her testimony in Behind Closed Doors in 2000?
I'm thinking now. Tell me if you think that this makes any sense, Francis. When the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation came out, and they published, for instance, for Kamloops, there are 51 names of children that
Mhm.
died during either at the school, although I think only two died at the school. The others died in hospital or reservations. And we have since, of course, gone through all those names, and we know exactly, I think for about six kids, how they died. All right, but only we know that, but the indigenous across Canada, they still don't know that unless they're tapping into some of our sites. But what I'm saying here is that there were 51 children there, and could they have looked at that and went, "Oh my God, our babies, our children, they died," and they jumped to conclusions and added more names. You see, they assumed that the named children were part of the ones in the apple orchard. So they just decided, well, 51, that's, let's make it, they got hyperbolic and they added more bodies because who has it, who knows? Nobody's done any excavation. Nobody was going to. They probably are preventing that from being done. So I'm just wondering if all the way along, because we know that the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, for each school, there are lists of names, and some of the schools have 200 names, others only have six. But maybe people have mistaken those children who typically died of disease or and often off site from the school. Maybe they're confusing this. Is that a possibility?
It's possible. There's a couple of things going on here. One is these lists of names of children who died, and the assumption that there was something nefarious that
Hmm.
happened for those
Hmm.
numbers of children to die. And there's been
Yeah.
a lot of research that's been done on these names for Kamloops. Nina Green is the primary researcher who's done this, but there's also another woman whose name is Judy, who's currently doing this too.
Hmm.
And interestingly, on that list of 51, which turns out, according to Jacques Briard and Nina Green, to be 49, because two are
Oh
duplicate
yeah. Mm-hmm.
names.
Mm-hmm.
Nellie Enias, who is also spelled Ignace, which is Ignace, who is Mona Jules' sister,
Yeah.
is not on that list of the 51/49.
And yet we
Uh,
knew she died during this time period.
yes, and we have her death certificate. She's one of interest because of Mona Jules and what Mona Jules has been saying.
Uh-huh.
But then we recently got another bunch of new numbers, so it's now 82 on the this kind of website for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and Nellie Enias is a name now on the 82.
Oh,
So this whole thing is just fascinating in terms of what's going on with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and where it's
yeah.
getting these names from, because the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was supposed to be the repository for records for the public,
Hmm.
so the public could become more informed, and researchers could go in and develop a better
Right.
understanding of the residential schools.
Right.
But as we know from my journey to the University of Manitoba, it is an unbelievable advocacy element in
Hmm.
the University of Manitoba that is trying to control all the information and is stopping people from looking at these records. And it's just been given another $20 million or something by Wab Kinew and his merry band of totalitarians there.
Dear.
Uh, so
Yeah.
it's just infuriating because there's a trust need for them to be playing this role or not. So now
Mhm.
there's all this uncertainty about who all the children who are died, and we cannot come to a definitive understanding. And
Yeah.
in my view, that is completely deliberate because what people are trying to do, and Sean Carlton is the worst perpetrator of this,
Yeah.
he continues to make this slippage
Yeah.
between the 215 slash 200 clandestine burials that are argued to exist
Right.
and the 51 slash 49 names of children who died either in
Hmm.
their home communities or in hospitals, or
Right.
there's only
Right.
two
Right.
who died at the residential schools itself, which
Hmm.
are,
Hmm.
I forget his name, George
Adrian,
is
Adrian George,
and Pearl, something Pearl,
Pearl
Pearl
Joe
Joe.
drowned. Yeah.
One drowned in the
Yeah.
river,
Yeah.
supposedly because they were swimming. And then I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but that's one of the reasons why they got the swimming pool built, is so that you could have more controlled swimming at the school. And then Adrian George, who died playing this game, uh, Cowboys and Indians, I think is the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
They say it's outlaw, but I think it's anyway. They were hanging someone
Right.
as a playing kind of item, and there was an
Hmm.
accident, and he was actually accidentally hanged. That
Yeah.
Adrian George is buried in the Lytton Cemetery. He was from Lytton. I'm
Hmm.
not sure where Pearl Joe is buried, but I think we have that information too. So that's out of all of this. We have
Hmm.
two
Hmm.
children who supposedly died at the school, and their whole circumstances are known, where they're buried is known, and
Right.
but what happened? So that's that whole picture.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happened is that in this $40,000 that was being granted to the band to go and develop their heritage park, to do something about artifacts and so on.
Hmm.
COVID hit and they weren't able to do that anymore. So they wanted to repurpose that $40,000
Yeah.
to be spent on for Dina Jules's comfort. So it was Dina Jules who got this done.
Yeah.
She wanted to look for the kids as
Yeah.
head
Yes.
goddesses, and she claims she always knew that children were buried. This is in the Fifth Estate program. She
Right.
always knew children were buried, and so that was her whole project.
Hmm.
She got,
Yeah.
and then they did this big hunt for the appropriate, sensitive, culturally sensitive GPR operator,
Hmm.
not a geoscientist who would do it properly, but a
Yeah.
conflict anthropologist who had connections to Simon Fraser archaeology and Eldon Yellowhorn and so on.
Right. Right.
They
Yeah.
brought in Sarah Bollier. They primed her big time with all the spiritual ceremonies and the spiritual supports and everything, got
Hmm.
her to run her GPR machine over this field,
Hmm.
and she came up with the number 215.
Right.
And also, there was some talking about how these children would have been as young as 3 years old. Either Sarah Bollier said this in May 2021, or it was interpreted as her meaning this. Anyway, so we
Right.
got the phrase in the press release in May 2021, children as young as 3 years old. But because 215 was the number that she came up with,
Hmm.
that's where we got this 200 plus kind of thing. It's because of the hits on the GPR. So we have these two separate stories, the 4951, the 215, and they kind of became sort of conflated together. And poor excuses for academics such as Sean Carlton have been gleefully
Yeah.
um, helping us in our misinterpretation of this. And for this terrible disservice to the Canadian public,
Hmm.
John Carlton has just been awarded some prestigious
Really.
Royal Society of Canada, kind of
But
entrance.
but what if we were to send the 51 names or 49 with the death certificates, with the actual way they died, okay, and said, look, these people are conflated over here with apparently the 200 buried in the apple orchard, and yet look, we have, causes of deaths for these 49. Now, what are the chances that if there are another 100 or whatever in the apple orchard that we couldn't do the exact same thing? But of course, all of this is moot because what should happen is there should be DNA probes done to see if there's anything human under the soil. That's all it would take.
Yeah, and I think the DNA probes, I'm a little bit less certain about that technology. I don't know how accurate it is. I don't know if it's going to be contaminated, but certainly the excavations, they did it at Pine Creek,
Yeah.
and you don't even you just have to take the soil, just start just looking a little bit and see what's there. Um, but just to end on the RCMP, which like all these
Mm,
deaths and things, this is like the interesting conflation. But in terms of the RCMP not investigating,
yeah.
why do you think that the RCMP, because as I said, in the 1990s, the RCMP did this thorough thing. Anything that anyone came forward, it would investigate. And now it has this strange, we're just going to take a back seat. We're just going to allow the band to do it. Why do you think that there's been that change in approach from the RCMP in the 1990s to the RCMP today in 2021 to 2025?
Well, I can't say for certain, but maybe they've just um they it was starting off, it was probably assumed to be unbelievable because who would be killing children? Okay, when they didn't find any initially, then there's other, fast forward a couple more years, there's apparently 215 in the apple orchard. They uh, they probably doubted it. They probably said, no, there aren't, and we're not going to look into it. It's like anything else. You can suggest that, let's say your kid doesn't come home from school on one day, and you go to the police. They'll say, no, no, we have to wait a while and see what happens. Well, in this case, there has been a while. However, we don't have any names. Well, who do you think's buried there? Well, why would you think this? You see, all you have to do is ask those kinds of questions, and the police are going to say, well, what do you want us to do? Hmm? Like, why don't you get in there with a shovel, and if you hit a coffin, let us know. We'll come and we'll do something. But they're not doing that, are they? Because they probably know there's nobody, there's nothing in there.
It doesn't seem to
There's
be
nothing
very
there.
much like I think the police
Mm.
need to be provided with some kind of evidence to go forward with
Well,
things.
there is none.
And if you were to say, my mother told me that there's children buried in my backyard, and I go to the police and say, hey, I just had this, my mother, I just found this thing from my mother. It's a letter. She says there's children buried in the backyard.
Hmm.
They're going to go, well, how did that happen? Was she like they're going to do some background investigation to see if that's a my mother was hallucinating or just like was a
Right.
someone who was just trying to fool
Yeah.
people or whatever. Like you're gonna do a sort of an investigation to determine whether there's anything to this claim. And it appears as if the RCMP did look at this and just decided because of the lack of evidence that they're
Yes.
not going to go forward with it. That's a
That's right.
likely explanation.
Yeah, well, if somebody had shown up with even a name, at least if it's your mother missing, you have a name and a description. We have nothing.
Yeah. And there's a couple of other interesting things that have happened that might explain the RCMP's reaction. The first is Murray Sinclair's statement in June, I think it's June 3rd,
Mm-hmm.
2021, where he gave this statement in some parliamentary committee about how the police were harassing Sarah Bollier
Oh,
by
yeah.
asking her questions, and Sarah Bollier um, should get legal representation to protect herself from this kind of aggressive
Yes.
behavior on
Yeah.
behalf of the police.
He called them ham-fisted or ham. I think he said ham-handed. He meant ham-fisted. That's the term.
Yes,
Ham-handed,
yes,
as if they were like bullying her and threatening
yes.
her. I don't
When,
think so.
like, what would you do if you were the RCMP? Obviously, you would start with the
Yeah,
GPR operator, because then you would be able to kind of ask some questions about their methodology and stuff, which, of course, if we had
sure.
openness of geoscientists, which we've talked to a number of, Simon and I have talked to a number, they're
Hmm.
afraid for their jobs.
No
They
way.
say that if it gets out all that we're talking to you,
Yeah.
our companies will fire us because we're dependent upon
Mm.
contracts with Aboriginal communities, and they will blacklist us if we become involved in any of these discussions. So
Well, that's
that is
corrupt. That's just plain corrupt.
so this is very disturbing that we don't have any of the experts, and this includes archaeologists too, who
Yeah.
also are under the thumb of this kind of whole kind of framework. So that's the first thing, is the Murray Sinclair kind of intervention. The
Yeah.
second intervention was from the 22 lawyers who made
Hmm.
a complaint with the International Criminal Court on, I believe it was June 3rd as well. So this came out at about the same time.
Hmm.
Murray Sinclair's comments and this complaint. And they said that the RCMP would be in a conflict of interest position because these and they referred to it as a mass grave and children buried, that the RCMP were likely responsible or had some role that they played in these children who were buried clandestinely in this apple orchard. So it really should be an international body that
Right.
investigates allegations of genocide that should be involved, and not the RCMP, and the RCMP should step back. And that complaint was copied to Sidney Lackey, who was the superintendent of
Right.
the RCMP. So they really wanted the RCMP to see that as well, so that the RCMP would back away and not involve itself in the investigation.
It's been so mishandled.
And here we are today. And then the final reason I should mention is self government. So
Oh,
we have all sorts of institutions saying these days that it should be up to Aboriginal people to determine how their affairs are run. Any intervention from institutions that are Canadian or British Columbian
hmm.
amounts to another form of colonization, and therefore these institutions should all stand down and allow the Aboriginal group itself to look after this matter.
Well, we need accountability, and the way to do that is to determine if the truth, the actual truth, is being told. And I that's why we investigate. We haven't done any investigation. We have not. We have not got our shovels there to see what's actually present. And of course, Kamloops is the foundation of the pyramid, and the pyramid keeps on going up and up and up. We haven't got to the apex yet, but Kamloops is the foundation because we're going with what they said. You know, there's dead children here. Oh my God, it's your fault. And then all the other residential schools jump on the bandwagon. You know, the Indians who had relatives there. It's pernicious, really, and I think it's all based on the almighty dollar. You know, there's money out there, and the more you complain, the more money you get.
And this kind of parallelism, I would argue, this whole mentality of parallelism, which has been unfolding since the 1970s,
Mm,
which is when integration was kind of given up on.
hmm.
And it was said that we should have these parallel paths that exist side by side, with neither the non-Aboriginal society interfering in Aboriginal ways or the Aboriginal society interfering in the non-Aboriginal ways. These two-row wampum, what was called the two-row wampum approach. But of
Yeah, but
course,
it's our
that
money they're going after.
well, there's two things. One is you got $12.1 million from public funds,
Yeah.
and if we're going to just say anything that Aboriginal groups get, they can just do whatever they want with it. I don't think that most Canadians would feel that was a very satisfactory kind of approach. But the second thing is a more fundamental one, which is one about truth, which we were talking about earlier, which is we are being accepted. And I've seen this now, as you know, especially at
Hmm.
the University of Winnipeg, where
Yeah.
I'm basically being told that I've got to accept the truth of these Aboriginal knowledge keepers. And if I don't accept that truth, I am going to be assaulted and perhaps even killed because of that, because I am this pernicious monster who does not deserve to live in this world, because I am insisting on a universal understanding of truth. And I perfectly well understand that memories from 50, 60 years ago are
Yes.
highly unreliable and open
Right,
to
right.
suggestibility, as
Yep.
we've seen in many other cases of hysterias that have taken place in
Yep.
various other contexts.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have no way of, because there wasn't, well, they have oral history, there wasn't anything written down. We have no way of verifying anything that's being said. People can say anything, make anything up if there's, especially if you've got more than one or two people, you've got a whole tribe singing from the same page. Well, how are you going to dispute that? Nothing's been written down. And of course, we won't go with our shovels into the cemetery and say, look, there's nothing here. Well, Kamloops anyways, and say, there's nothing here for God's sakes. What are you talking about? We're being sold a bill of goods.
We're being manipulated. We
Hmm.
still don't know really the source of it, because a lot of the information is missing. But
Hmm.
this is what we need to find out, and we need to get to the truth. This
Yeah,
is the bottom line: is that, in
yeah,
my view, Kamloops is the card in the house of cards.
yep.
People are fighting very, very hard to maintain the Kamloops deception, because
Hmm.
if the Kamloops card starts to get pulled out, that whole foundation and that house of cards is going to become more unsteady. And people are
Yes.
going to start to wonder, if we were deceived so much with respect to this issue concerning the Kamloops residential
Hmm.
school, what other kinds of things are
Yes.
being invented, distorted, and
Hmm.
so on, to
Hmm.
manipulate us into other courses of action?
Well, exactly. And I think the answer is we just somehow we have to stop the flow of money going into these kinds of activities. We've got to stop the money. The government's got to wake up and smell the coffee. They've got to put on their big boy pants and stop the funding.
And this is not to say that there's terrible deprivation in Aboriginal communities that needs to be addressed, but
Hmm.
sending a whole bunch of money for people like Sarah Bollier to do these ridiculous scams that are incompetent to begin with, all the publicists, all the consultants, all the lawyers who have made money off of this,
Yeah.
sending money to them
Hmm.
does nothing to address the terrible social conditions that everyone agrees needs to be addressed through some kind of strategic exercise to figure out what are the
Hmm.
problems, what are the causes of the problems, and how, what needs to be done to be able to address those terrible conditions.
Well, I forget the indigenous, maybe it was Chief Dan George who said, education is our buffalo. Now, before the buffalo, everybody was blaming the disappearance of the buffalo and the start of reservations on the decline of the indigenous people, their sort of their status decline. Well, now it's been said, education is your buffalo. Yeah, get yourself educated, go and learn how to manage yourselves properly. If you want to have self-governance, if you want to live apart, learn how to do it properly, learn how to be sustainable. All of these things have to be taken into
Education.
consideration. Oh,
Education, as Murray Sinclair said.
education.
Well, no, I don't want to, because I don't like that quote at all.
Mm,
Education is what's going to get us out of that. It wasn't education that got us into this mess.
no,
Education doesn't get you into a mess. It
not
was,
usually. Mm,
insensitivity, difficulties of dealing
yeah,
with cultures at vastly different levels of development.
yeah.
There's a bunch of different reasons why we are currently in this situation. And
Hmm.
then, of course, the funding of the Aboriginal industry that began to happen in the late 60s and the early 70s, which
Hmm.
had the government diverting money to Aboriginal groups without trying to actually address the serious social problems which existed. So I
Right.
think education, I think that's something to end on, is
It's
we need
important.
actual education on
Yeah,
what's happened historically in Canada, not the propaganda that we're getting fed, because we're told if we don't accept the propaganda, we're not compassionate people and we've got some moral failing, which is not allowing us to fully understand the situation.
that's right. Yeah, education is the answer.
Anyway, Shannon, I wanted to thank you so much for appearing on this interview. I think we covered a lot of ground,
Hmm.
but there's very important information from a whole bunch of different angles that
Yes,
people will be able to listen to.
I think so. Well, thank you for having me on, Francis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.